Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Kerry-Ann. I'm a psychiatrist practicing here in Massachusetts, and this is a show that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community and beyond. And today, it's time for a spring cleaning. Today, it's going to be a show that's just a check in with Dr. Kerry-Ann. We're going to just take stock of where we are this time in the year and how you can boost your mental health. So, how are you doing? How are you doing at this time in the year? Things have changed quite a bit since my last check in, which was in September of 2021. I saw a news headline the other day, and it said, "We have now entered the choose your own adventure phase of the pandemic." And I thought that was a really great description. I think, with the dropping of most of the mask mandates, there's been some debate. And particularly, healthcare professionals have debated whether or not the mask mandates should be dropped. People with certain health conditions, people with small children who don't qualify for vaccination yet, have been particularly less happy about dropping of mask mandates. Um, and so this term, this choose your own adventure term, is referencing how I think people feel like adults now have all the resources that they need to choose their level of precautions, to kind of choose their own adventure. So, unlike in 2020, we now have vaccines. We have all this hand sanitizer we need. We have multiple types of masks: cloth, surgical, KN95, N95. We have face shields, gloves, you name it. So we have a lot of ways to do the best we can to protect ourselves for most healthy adults. And though COVID cases are still happening and healthcare providers are working to treat people with complications, hospitals are back to scheduling routine surgeries and other types of medical care that was on hold earlier in the pandemic. So the pandemic is not officially over, but we do have more choices than we used to. And so I wanted to find out, how are you doing at this point in the pandemic? Let's check in. So it's spring. It's a time of year when we think about spring cleaning in our homes and sometimes spring cleaning in our businesses. But what about spring cleaning your mental health? What would that look like? So, first of all, the pandemic has done a number on our psychological state, especially since we're not fully out of the woods yet. We're in a recovery from a prolonged state of fear, threat of death by this invisible illness, worries about practical needs, separation from family members and friends, and cancellation of events. We're grieving losses that we can't regain. We've lost time that we're trying not to think about. At least I'm trying not to think about all the time that I've lost. At this point, do you feel exhausted with all that you've been through? Do you feel hopeful that we're near the end? Do you feel relieved that it seems as though the worst has passed? Or do you feel frustrated that people aren't taking this seriously enough? Are you frustrated that people are relaxing too soon? Are you feeling afraid that you are still at high risk? How are you feeling? Now, regardless of what you feel, remember to be compassionate towards those around you that may have different feelings and maybe making different choices. Be strong with your choices while still being careful. Make space to grieve your losses. Don't ignore them or deny them. And think about all the things that you've gained during the pandemic. Yes, there have been good things happening as well. I call them pandemic positives. What are your pandemic positives? What are you grateful for? Did you start a new hobby? Did you get your health under control? Some people exercised and lost weight during the pandemic, other people gained weight. Did you start therapy during the pandemic? Because with the switch over to telehealth, a lot of people started therapy by telehealth. Try to fight all the negatives by focusing on the positives. It's time to do some spring cleaning for your thoughts. If you find yourself drowning in fear and negativity, there's a story that you may know. It is a story of a man walking by some elephants and noticing that a small rope was around one of their legs. He thought to himself, isn't the elephant big and strong enough to break that rope and go free? He wondered why these small ropes seemed to keep the elephants in place. The trainer told him it starts when they're very small. When the elephants are young, the ropes are strong enough to keep them in place. They initially try to fight it, but eventually they learn to stop trying to fight to get free from the rope. They learn that they cannot be free. Then they grow into adult elephants that are large and strong, but they still do not try to break free from the rope because they've learned that they can't. And this story is about mindset. What you believe determines how far you can go. A negative mindset is limiting. A negative mindset leads to depression, and it leads to pessimism disguised as realism, and it leads to underachieving. A positive and optimistic mindset leads to a more balanced and realistic worldview and reaching as far as life can take you. Coming out of this pandemic, I encourage you to fight the negative by focusing on the positives. Be realistic, take precautions, the pandemic is not over, and still be optimistic. Spring clean your thoughts and have faith. Now, the next thing I want to check in with you about is your work. How is your work? Have you changed jobs during the pandemic? Have you shifted responsibilities? Did you start a side hustle? Are you working less? Are you working more? Or are you working just about the same as you did before? Is your work less stressful? Is your work more stressful? Or is it about just the same as it was before? And where is your job taking you in terms of your overall goals? For some for some people, I guess, the pandemic was a time to reflect on priorities. It was a time to review short-term and long-term goals. Were you able to do that? What did you find out? There's another short story that I want to share with you, and it's probably my favorite motivational story. It's an old Brazilian short story, and it goes like this. There was once a businessman who was sitting on the beach in a small Brazilian village. As he sat, he saw a fisherman rowing a small boat towards the shore, having caught quite a few big fish. The businessman was impressed. He asked the fisherman, "How long does it take you to catch these fish?" The fisherman replied, "Oh, just a short while." The businessman said, "Well, why don't you stay longer at sea and catch even more fish?" The fisherman said, "Well, this is enough to feed my family." The businessman said, "So then what do you do for the rest of the day?" And he said, "Well, I usually wake up early in the morning. I go out to sea, catch a few fish. Then I go back and I play with my kids. In the afternoon, I take a nap with my wife. And evening comes, I join my buddies in the village for a drink. We play guitar, sing, and dance throughout the night." So the businessman said to the fisherman, "Listen, I have a PhD in business management. Let me tell you, I could help you to become more successful. From now on, I'm telling you that you should spend more time at sea to try to catch as many fish as possible. Then, when you've saved enough money, you could buy a bigger boat and catch even more fish. Soon, you'll be able to afford to buy more boats, set up your own company, your own production plant for canned food and distribution, and all of that. And by then, you would have moved out of this village, go to the big city. You can set up headquarters to manage your other branches. You'll be a successful businessman." And so the fisherman says, "Okay, and then what happens after that?" The businessman says, "Well, then you can live like a king in your own house. When the time is right, you go public, you float your shares in the stock exchange. You'll be really, really rich." And the fisherman said, "Well, What happens after that? And then the businessman says, well, after you get really rich, you can finally retire. You can move to a house, buy a nice small fishing village, wake up early in the morning, catch a few fish, then return home to play with your kids, have a nice afternoon nap with your wife. Then in the evening, you can join your buddies for a drink, play the guitar, sing and dance through the night. Well, you know the ending. The fisherman says, well, isn't that what I'm doing right now? I like this story because it makes me think about the rat race. Here we have a fisherman who basically catches enough fish for his family and then spends the rest of his day really investing in relationships and enjoying his life. And a businessman comes along and says, you're not doing enough. You could be really, really rich if you really work harder and essentially join the rat race. But the end of it all is that he's going to retire and do the exact same thing that he's doing right now. And I think sometimes in life, we can get so caught up in the details. We're socialized to believe that certain things matter a lot more than they actually do. It's time to spring clean your goals, okay? So the question I have for you today is, what is your ultimate goal? What are you working towards? Who is your hard work for? And what is the cost of your work? So some of you left your jobs during the pandemic. How is that working out for you? What are your next steps? Okay, it's time to spring clean your goals. Now, the next thing I want to check in on is rest. During the pandemic, some of you had more time to rest. I'm not included in that number, but some of you had more time to rest. What's the status of that right now? Are you back to an overloaded schedule? If so, maybe it's time for spring cleaning your schedule. Maybe this spring is a time to rebalance. So look at what your schedule is for the next 2 months. What do you have the power to change in your schedule? How much of your overcommitment is due to feelings of obligation or feelings of guilt? How much of your overscheduling is due to fear? Fear of being seen as lazy, fear of missing out, FOMO, fear of underachievement. What about those of you that are kind of overscheduled because you're interested in everything? You want to do everything. Okay. It's hard to turn things down because you genuinely want to do everything, but everything is wearing you down because you can't do everything. What does your spring cleaning look like if you genuinely want to do all the things on your schedule? Now, here's what I would say. In order to facilitate rest, you have to make sacrifices. People talk a lot about boundaries and saying no, and we rarely use the word sacrifice. I'm going to use the word sacrifice because rest depends on your ability to lose something that you hold as important. A lot of times we talk about spring cleaning our schedule, and there's this perception that there's a lot of unimportant things that we're doing that we need to get rid of. But for a lot of us, a lot of what we're doing is important. And so sacrifice is about losing something that you hold as important. Because it's easy to rationalize everything on your schedule as important. Um, As I said, I'm willing to bet that many items on your schedule have not really anything to do with boundaries. We talk a lot about boundaries, but it probably doesn't have much to do with boundaries. Our schedules are usually filled with a mix of like obligations and interests, things we're obligated to do and things we're interested in doing. And sometimes, yes, we do get caught up saying we're going to do things that maybe we don't really want to do, and we should say no to. But that's probably not the majority of our schedule. That's probably like 5 to 10% of our schedule. So what about the other 90%? So I'm using the word sacrifice when it comes to spring cleaning our personal schedules and our work schedules, because sacrifice is about giving up something of value for the purpose of gaining something else, often something intangible of much more value that comes at a later date. So sacrifice involves delayed gratification. It involves saying no to something right now in order to get something else much later. And also, using the word sacrifice gives you a preview of the kind of emotional experience that you might have when you start to make the changes in your schedule that leads to carving out space for rest. Okay. So now, if this were easy, okay, if it were easy, there wouldn't be so much written about this topic and I wouldn't be talking about it. So, the question I have for you in this check in today is, are you setting aside time to rest? And is there something in your schedule that you need to sacrifice in order to carve out time to rest? Something that you do hold as important, but you have to let go of and sacrifice in order to gain something much greater, which is necessary rest and balance. And if you're not setting that side, if you're not setting that time aside, what is the cost of not sacrificing? What's the cost? And if you are setting time aside, what are you sacrificing? Reflect on that. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to check in with you on today are relationships. How are your relationships? The pandemic led us into a time of physical separation. It was challenging both to maintain relationships and to initiate new ones. I find it interesting that, prior to the pandemic, some writers used to express concern that the rise of social media was leading to less in-person interaction. But what the pandemic really showed us is that what people wrote about, all that fears about decreased in-person interaction because of social media, that was a false alarm. When faced with an actual situation where we could not have in-person interactions, we realized the magnitude of how much we relied on in-person interactions. The virtual format was not even close. And people who study social media will tell you that social media does not necessarily threaten in-person interactions, but what it does is it tends to amplify a person's true individual nature, okay? But it doesn't threaten relationships so much. In any case, relationships took a battering during the pandemic. So I don't know about you guys, but I didn't switch to virtual conversations with all of my friends. I'm a kind of an in-person kind of person. And so I like seeing my friends and my family in person. And so now there are some people that I literally haven't seen for 2 years because I tend to rely a lot on in-person interactions. So I don't know. I mean, do any of you out there have a similar situation where you just haven't seen people for 2 years and you haven't really connected with them? What is your plan to restore those relationships? You should have a plan to restore those relationships. And are there some relationships that you don't plan to restore? Was it an opportunity to break free from certain people that you disliked? Well, did you spring clean your relationships? Well, that's not my situation. I'm really hoping to get reconnected to everyone. And it's a tricky time because not everyone's comfortable yet with in-person gatherings. So you may not be able to reconnect with everybody in person, even still. And how do you feel about that? How do you feel about us getting so far into the pandemic and still, in some ways feeling restricted about in-person interactions? But if these relationships are still important to you, then I would encourage you to keep reaching out by telephone and by text. Don't lose the connection. Okay. So guys, that's my spring cleaning check-in. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. That's my check-in for today. And my final question is, what do you need to spring clean in your life right now? What do you need to spring clean in your life right now? Thanks for joining the show, and I will talk with you next time. Bye.